In March, Mahmoud Khalil, a Columbia University student, Palestinian activist, and legal permanent resident, green card holder, became just the first high-profile case of an international student ordered deported following protest activity. More have followed. Meanwhile, the administration has revoked the visas of more than 1,000, at least count, international students, including a handful of students here at Rice University. The Trump administration is now outsourcing much of its deportation agenda beyond U.S. borders, sending hundreds of detainees both to Guantanamo Bay, hold that space because they went and then departed in most cases, and to a maximum security prison in El Salvador called CECOT, a special facility originally designed for terrorism detainees, with little or no due process under U.S. law as it is understood. One man famously deported to CECOT is Kilmar Brego Garcia, who the administration admitted it had deported in error and yet has quite publicly refused to bring back. To help us understand this moment and the potential long-term consequences, at least as we can discern things now, beyond U.S. borders, social, political, legal consequences, I'm joined by three experts from across Rice University. Tony Payan, our director of the Baker Institute Center for the U.S. and Mexico, Luz Maria Garcini, an assistant professor of psychological sciences and director of the Center for Community and Public Health at the Kinder Institute for Urban Research here, and David Donati, a senior staff attorney at the ACLU of Texas and lecturer at Rice. I'm David Satterfield, director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, and this is Baker Briefing. Hello to all of you. This is going to be a long discussion, I think, and could go longer still if we had the time. This isn't the first time a U.S. administration has prioritized cleaning up illegal undocumented immigrants, including deportations. And it is the second term for President Donald Trump. So what's different about his current approach? I'm going to turn first to you.
Yes, many things. Thank you for that question, actually. I would like to say the first thing that comes to my mind is that we're no longer in a pandemic. So the message was not as aggressive as it is right now, in the rhetoric that has been happening, in the way that a lot of these deportations are seen. You just mentioned, even without due process, that these people have been sent to one of the most high security prisons in El Salvador. The other one, and I can speak of that because I hear it from members in the community, is that now you have agents showing up to school settings, right? Now you have agents showing up to people's homes. So this is creating a lot of justified fear that is putting people on edge in the way without having people a chance to react has become really, really hard for the community.
And David, the causes, at least in terms of public attention to the phenomenon, certainly stem from that extraordinary inflow of asylum cases and the deferred processing in the judicial system of the claims to asylum. Over 1 million individuals came across the southern border. Put that for one moment aside. If you look at the situation right now, Luz, you referred to ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement officials, very high-profile show-ups across the country, but relatively few actual deportations have occurred. A great deal of sound and fury. But David, how much real action has there been?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's a very good one because we need to level set. These are early days still, and that is to me a terrifying prospect. And so I think that there are two fundamental things that I see. One of them that is part of this project is redefining belonging in the United States. And so we look at a lot of policies as falling into those definitions of what it means to be an American, and more importantly, what it means to be excluded from American belonging. That was the Birthright Citizenship Executive Order that says, well, being born here isn't enough. The president can define administratively whether a baby can be deported or whether a baby is entitled by right, having been born here, to American citizenship. We see it as well in the revocation of student statuses. By my last count, it's about 1,600 students across the United States. And we see it in other ways that the administration is taking people who by all accounts have legal status and taking it away. And this is something that I shout from the mountaintops because I appreciate the fear and anxiety that comes with millions of people coming between ports of entry. And something that is important to emphasize and re-emphasize is that people will follow the processes that you give them to migrate legally. And so if we have meaningful ways for people to come and work and live, they will do so. The problem is we haven't redefined our immigration system in decades, and the asylum system allows you to apply for asylum whether or not you arrive at a port of entry, and so that was the avenue available to people. But in this moment, we are seeing people who have temporary protected status, who have pending asylum applications, being deprived of those statuses and subject to arrest, detention, and deportation. So the first is belonging. And the second thing that I want to emphasize now is that this is not just about redefining American belonging, but it is an effort to augment and aggrandize executive power. And I think that's a very unique aspect of this iteration of the Trump administration. This is Mr. Garcia's case. This is also the Alien Enemies Act cases, if you've been following them. It is an effort to remove people without even the minimum due process that has been codified in our immigration laws since the 1990s.
You talked just a minute about the 1798 law that has been invoked now. It's not the first time in modern history it's been invoked, but that has been, as I understand it in the past, for only extraordinarily brief, exceptional circumstances, mass rioting and destruction, or a specific law and order problem in a place at a particular time.
Yes, absolutely. So the Alien Enemies Act is from 1798. It was part of a quartet of laws. The other three have been repealed, very famously, the Alien and Seditions Acts. But the Alien Enemies Act has survived. It's only been used a few times in our history, most notably during World War II as a basis to intern Japanese Americans. What makes this example unique is that the Alien Enemies Act has never been invoked in a situation where there is not a congressionally declared war, and it has never been invoked to target non-state actors. Here, the Trump administration is claiming that the alien enemies are members of a Venezuelan-based gang called Tren de Aragua. So it's not about a war with Venezuela. It's not about a declared war. It is about alleged affiliation with this gang, TDA.
Tony, we've talked often, you've spoken here at Baker Briefing in the past, about the changing phenomenon of migration from Mexico, but more significantly through Mexico from other countries. As you look at the changes in immigration patterns in recent years, not just from Central America, but also from places very far removed from this hemisphere, but coming through Central America because of ease of visa-free entry, what's changed? What's different about the phenomenon? And what's Mexico doing about this?
The issue of immigration between Mexico and the United States, I think, has been a constant, beginning with the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty back in 1848, when Mexicans already in California and Texas were given a choice to go back to Mexico or to stay in the United States. So at the same time, in the 19th century, Mexicans were given the opportunity to come and go. There was no visa required for Mexicans until 1929. At that point, I think the visa was required because we have to remember there was a Great Depression, the stock market crash, and there were a lot of other economic issues. So it became kind of an economic issue. And we have to remember in the 1930s, some 500,000 Mexican Americans born in the U.S. were deported to Mexico. So this has happened before, where U.S. citizens are massively deported, and this was in the 1930s. By 1942, when the U.S. entered the war, the labor of Mexican workers is required again, and they established the Bracero program. During the 22 years, 42 to 64, about 5 million Mexican citizens went back and forth to work in agriculture and other industries in the United States. In 64, the program is canceled, and the number of individuals that engage in something that was called the circular migration goes on between 64 and 86, another 20 years or so, when Ronald Reagan declares an amnesty for some 3 million undocumented residents in the United States. And then the numbers begin to go up because the border is militarized, physical infrastructure is built slowly in the late 80s and 90s on the border, and people, instead of going back and forth, begin to stay put. And the number of undocumented immigrants just skyrockets to close to 12 million or so. In 2007, the numbers sort of stabilized. And in 2012, I think we saw something that was peculiar, different, and I think it's partly the origin of the crisis today, and that has to do with caravanization of migration. That was the first time, and I recall the summer of 2012, under the Obama administration, when we saw some 7,000 folk marching from Chiapas across Mexico all the way to the border. That was really something different, because it was families, children, women, huge numbers on foot going north. And I think that was the beginning. I think that was a transformation. And by 2015, 2016, I think Trump clearly detected that there was a political issue. The images were so striking of all these people coming in. So he saw a good political opportunity. And here we are, I think, 13 years later, and still playing that immigration card.
Tony, you talked about the caravanization of immigration as an issue for the first term of President Trump. Now it's about criminal gangs. That's the rubric, the label under which so much of this is justified. What's the reality as far as can be discerned? And I'll ask both you and David for comment here. Is in fact organized non-Mexican, because the accusations are against Venezuelan and other third country gang members, is it that significant a structured problem as to justify these exceptional measures being taken?
Not really. In fact, I'm going to be bold and say that we don't really have an immigration crisis. I really don't think so. I think it's largely manufactured. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't who knows how many undocumented residents in the United States today. We have problems with the immigration system. It's not flexible enough. It doesn't really provide for the workforce, the labor that the country needs. These folks come in and they pretty quickly find jobs, which means that this economy has been so dynamic, well above Asian economies, well above European economies, that it needs workers. We wrote a paper called The Graying of America as well. You know, we're kind of getting older, we're retiring, and we're not really growing fast enough. So I think the problem is not immigrants. I think the problem is that the immigration system has not kept up with American needs for additional labor, demographically, economically, and so forth. So I think Mexico has been under a lot of pressure by the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, and now, at this point, I travel over to El Paso and Ciudad Juarez quite often, and I can tell you that the refugee centers are empty. Reynosa is the same thing. There's practically no immigrants at the border yet. So what the Trump administration is doing to maintain this momentum and this continue playing the immigration card in the public policy sphere and sort of feed his political base is to then turn inward and begin to go after professors and foreign students and green card holders and worksite raids, separating families, and now even questioning the citizenship of all those of us who are here and are citizens. And it's a way of sort of saying, I'm watching you, I'm here, and I'm going to continue playing this card. And because you have no asylum seekers at the border any longer, Mexico has been very cruel, successfully stopped migrants coming through Mexico, then now it's us. It's kind of evolving in a perverse way.
Tony, as you can discern, is Mexico at its southern border imposing greater controls now than would have been the case 6 months ago?
I think that Mexico was under pressure during the first Trump administration, and I think the numbers began to go down in 2019 because Trump threatened a number of actions against Mexico, and I think López Obrador, to himself not draw attention to some of the stuff that he was doing in Mexico and was not acceptable, the democratic backsliding, control of opposition, you know, all kinds of things that he was doing. He simply was very successful at reducing the U.S.-Mexico relationship to the immigration issue. So he says, if I do what Trump is asking me to do on immigration, then he's not going to pay attention to anything else that's happening in Mexico.
And President Sheinbaum?
Yes, so that changed. I think President Sheinbaum has no choice. She is up against the wall with the tariffs. I think the tariffs are a new tactic that Trump didn't really use in the first administration. So this is completely new, and Mexico is heavily dependent. And I'll tell you, when people say, oh, the tariffs are working, what really worked in the Mexican case, I think, and brought the numbers to a fraction, probably about a third, was the agreement that the Biden administration concluded with the Mexican government in, I think it was late December 2023, and the changes to the asylum system that were published on May 11th of 2024. That brought the numbers way down. By the end of 24, they were practically a fraction. And now they're probably 5% or less than what they used to be. So the problem is, as it was presented to us, solved by 24. So why is it that in 25, we're now beginning to see how the use of immigration is now being turned against U.S. citizens, U.S. legal permanent residents, students with legal visas that were issued by the State Department? We're seeing some real transformation that I think we ought to be watching.
And David, Tony asserts that the gang justification isn't really substantively demonstrated. What's your experience shown in terms of the legal issue involved here? Not the question of legality of deportation, but is there a gang problem? Is there a specific attributable group that can be found, identified, and specifically legally targeted here?
So I always try to have a lot of deference to law enforcement organizations, political leaders like Governor Abbott and President Trump, who I admit they have information I do not have access to as a civilian. And so I always try and have that kind of deference. With that being said, we have talked to so many of these people. We have been in immigration detention facilities. And to a person, I have not seen anything that makes me question whether these people are involved in gang activity. More to the point, the vast majority of people on which we have any information not only have no proof of gang affiliation, but they have no criminal record here or in other countries. And ultimately, what we are demanding is due process. And so I think that's the really fundamental thing that we need to hammer home, which is if you are telling us that there's a gang issue, it is my view, as a civil rights attorney who's worked on a range of issues for many years, that we have systems in place to address real threats. Our criminal legal system is well equipped to identify dangerous actors who have committed crimes and bring them to justice. There is very little dispute in my mind that when law enforcement is involved and investigates a crime, oftentimes it is able to identify the perpetrators and bring them to justice. And that's not the situation that we have here. Here we have somebody say so and immediate irreparable consequences as people are being shuffled around detention facilities and potentially shipped overnight to detention centers from which the administration says it cannot bring people back.
There is a related but very separate phenomenon underway now, which is, of course, the revocation of student visas. There, the labeling is somewhat different. It's not based on national origin or allegation of criminal gang membership, but rather seems to fall under a broad actions contrary to the foreign policy interests of the United States, which gives the Secretary of State almost unchallengeable authority on his own declaration, that of the Department of State, to revoke these visas. Anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic actions, support for terrorist groups, Hamas most notably, have been cited. But I want to challenge you with a question. Is what's going on here really not related to immigration or criminal gangs or anti-Semitism or student activity, but attempts to demonstrate a theory of a unitary presidency?
That is absolutely my view. I started off by saying two things. One is it's about defining what is American and what's not. And the other is it's about aggrandizing executive power. And I fully see that across the board. And immigration is the test case. And we can go back and we can look at what are the quote unquote plenary powers of the executive. Immigration has always been said to be one. Foreign affairs have been said to be one. And when we say plenary, we ask ourselves, what does that mean? Plenary means absolute. And for my entire life as an American, in my reading of the cases, there have always been checks and balances in the American system of government. The effort here is to say, no, plenary means plenary. And there are these spaces outside of congressional and judicial authority.
So where are the courts? Not just where are they, but when are they? How long does the process of a flooded zone of legal cases, one surprise after another, day and night, middle of the night decisions. How are the courts responding?
I will say, you're asking me this after what was probably one of the longest Friday nights of my life, last Friday. And that is because we've had this, I want to say long running, but we're probably talking about a few weeks, battle on the Alien Enemies Act at the ACLU. And that is a designation of any Venezuelan man who's over the age of 14 as a potential member of Tren de Aragua, and then the summary deportation of these individuals. My colleagues were able to secure an injunction, a block on this policy in the District of Columbia that went up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said it rejected the Trump administration's maximalist theory that what they say goes, but it also said that you have to challenge people's cases where they arise through a very specific legal mechanism called habeas corpus, which I can define, but I won't bore you if you don't need it. But the result of that was that the administration started moving people around. And so we had to follow that up with cases in New York or in southern Texas and Brownsville, where you have these immigration detention centers where people were being moved. We won temporary restraining orders, more injunctions, so the administration moves people again. It's kind of a game of cat and mouse. And in the Northern District of Texas, they found a judge who was not willing to intervene, at least in part because the government represented, well, you're representing two people. We won't deport those two people. But the government we had been able to track, moved over 100 people, Venezuelans, into that facility. And so that's what set off this flurry of filings at the end of last week with the district court, at the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, at the United States Supreme Court. I went to bed on Friday night truly believing we were in a constitutional crisis. At about 1 a.m, the Supreme Court intervened. And it is a temporary but very significant victory that prevents people from being removed out of that facility under the Alien Enemies Act. But this is a dynamic situation that we have to keep watching.
David, I'll ask you for a final question, if you can answer it, which I think may be on the minds of many here. Let's assume the Supreme Court rules in a fashion which directs the administration to, and here the choice of word of art is critical, facilitate, expedite, effect, different levels of legal meaning to all of those, shall, not should, bring people back who have been deported. The administration says, well, we understand the order, but it's not in our hands anymore. It's the responsibility of the government of El Salvador. What's the court's response likely to be to that?
The courts have options, but that's my long night of the soul, which is, what if this administration not only continues to play in the way that it has, facial compliance while stretching the words beyond their meaning, but also actively engages the court in a fight and says, Chief Justice Roberts has made his decision, now let him enforce it.
Andrew Jackson's
exactly, a slight paraphrase. But it's a fight that many people in the president's close circle are urging him to take on.
But here, and I apologize for, it's not really a digression. It's at the heart of much of this. What happens if a president, under any theory of unitary power, challenges implementation when it is in the power of the executive branch to do so? They have the ability to effect a response, to refuse to undertake that. What's the court's recourse?
The devil is going to be in the details. And I think that that's where the fight is. There will be government lawyers who go in front of judges and say, we are complying with this order, or we are acting in a way that is within the boundaries of our authority. You may have some judges and courts who then respond by saying, I disagree. And then the courts have an escalating series of tactics that they can use to enforce compliance. They can hold those individuals in contempt of court, threaten those individuals with jail time. They can conduct a series of discovery or try and uncover facts about, well, tell me who in the administration is ordering you to proceed in this way, potentially target those individuals with contempt. They can, as Judge Boasberg wrote in a 46-page order at the end of last week, even in some cases appoint a special prosecutor to bring on cases that United States attorneys, who are at the behest of the president, refuse to bring. But again, at that point, we have a fight between the judiciary and the president. And that may be a fight that is welcome in some circles. It's certainly not welcome to me.
And speaking from the standpoint of the Department of State, to bring back individuals now outside the jurisdiction of the United States, particularly in the case of a cooperative, compliant executive overseas, Bukele in El Salvador, I think the courts would be extremely loath to insist that the President of the United States must direct the activities of a foreign sovereign.
Absolutely.
However improper the act of transfer may have been, to attempt to compel the return, that's a much more difficult issue.
I think that may have been a reason why they chose not to use Guantanamo any longer, because there the U.S. government is in full control and they could be compelled to do it. If the prisoner, Abrego Garcia, for example, is in San Salvador in the CICOT facility, then they can always say, it's not in our hands, and so far has flown. I think the concern here for me is the fact that, because one of our colleagues at the university at some point made a comment saying, well, it's a Salvadoran citizen in the hands of El Salvador, there's nothing we can do. And I said, the material facts of the case now, that it was a mistake, that it's in El Salvador, that it's a Salvadoran citizen, that it's now under the custody of the Salvadoran government, are now irrelevant. What is relevant and should be relevant to us now is the fact that the courts ordered him to bring him back, and he has refused to do it. And it seems by the press conference that Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador, and Mr. Trump had together, they seem to have had a coordinated message. They both said exactly the same thing, which means they probably spoke before and they said, this is what we're going to say, this is what you're going to say. They both said, I can't do it. And so to me, that has trespassed into a point at which there is defiance of an order of the Supreme Court. And that doesn't bear on the fact that Abrego Garcia is a Salvadoran citizen in El Salvador.
Luz, what's the impact, as you all see it, looking especially in this area, of all of this on the affected communities?
Thank you for that question. I have to start by saying that the community is extremely resilient. So the numbers that I'm going to provide kind of don't truly reflect the core and the heart and their desire to just keep moving forward even in the face of adversity. But we know that from the studies that we have done, that 87% of undocumented immigrants who have resided in the United States for on an average of 20 years. So you can think of these people as being more like similar to a U.S. resident than an immigrant. They have a history of trauma of 87%. And I'm talking about high levels of severe trauma. So along with that, there's trauma-related stress. So what we're currently seeing is going to elevate those levels of distress. And we know that when people's mental health starts hurting, a lot of other things start falling off balance, right? Your ability to perform, your ability to achieve your best version of yourself in terms of how you perform at your work, how you perform in school, right? We see that a lot of the children in mixed status families, for instance, are having a lot of behavioral concerns, behavioral issues. And then we know from science that when your mental health starts struggling, it also gets under the skin. It affects your brain, it affects your blood, it leads to inflammation in your body that increases your risk for physical illness, for chronic diseases, for cardiovascular risk. And we have seen this in our studies over time. So we are building grounds for getting people sick, right? And that is not only to say that people are living in fear of seeking healthcare services, for instance, right? We currently have a project on immigrant maternal health, and you have mothers that are thinking, where am I going to deliver a baby? I'm terrified of just going to the hospital and just seek help. You have women who are living in conditions, for instance, of domestic violence. How am I going to go seek help, right? If I'm afraid that I'm going to be deported and what's going to happen with my children. So that is increasing the risk for more trauma. And then, as I mentioned, the consequences that come with trauma, which is physical and mental health repercussions for that.
Tony, the economic impact of all of this. You've done a lot of work on the labor market in the United States and the vacant jobs, the requirement for immigration. What's the economic impact of effective closure of the border, plus the mix of actual deportations at whatever real level that is, but maybe much more importantly, the fear of surfacing in the economy and being targeted? What's the impact?
Yeah, we know what the numbers are. We know that there are certain industries, agriculture, food processing, construction, that rely on immigrants, and many of them undocumented. So if you have a workforce of 168 million people in the United States, and you have somewhere between 11 and 12 million undocumented, 74 to 80% of them are working in those industries, largely taking care of the elderly and children. There's a number of activities that they engage in, formally and informally. So taking that workforce out of the United States, if you manage to deport 11 to 12 million, because I have to tell you that the latest numbers I saw are essentially that the Trump administration in its first 90 days has deported fewer immigrants than the Biden administration by a slight number, about 700 under the Biden administration per day to about 690 under the Trump administration. They just don't have the workforce. It's not very efficient to be looking for the immigrants all over the place. But if you take 6-7% of the workforce in a labor market that's already very tight, then you're going to hurt the economy, you're going to hurt certain industries. And then if you think about all the people that work in the United States, I mean, you got 15 million or so naturalized citizens. That's an important component of the workforce. And then you got 14 million green card holders. That's also an important component of the workforce. So if you add these 15 million and 14 million and 11 to 12 million undocumented and all the visa holders, all the agricultural workers that have an H-2A, H-2B visas and the H-1B visas, we rely on tens of millions of workers in this country. If we're going to have this kind of aggressive immigration policy, and we're going to try to get rid of all immigrants or most immigrants, and even intimidate citizens and green card holders, and perhaps even target them as well, then we're going to be essentially shooting ourselves in the foot. We're going to be damaging certain sectors of our economy. We're going to weaken our potential. And we have to remember also, 25% of all new businesses are started by immigrants, even though immigrants are about 14 to 15% of the population. So they start businesses at a higher rate than native U.S. citizens. So the value that immigrants bring to the economy is enormous in taxes, in production, in productivity, in economic activity, and on in entrepreneurship. I think it would be a mistake. What we need to do to solve this is look at the system itself and see if we can create the conditions to attract immigrants. You know, a colleague of mine, Ivan Rodriguez, and I asked through a FOIA request the TN visa. The TN visa is a visa created by NAFTA, now USMCA. So we got the data for about 25 years or so, 26 years, and we're looking at it. And it's an incredibly interesting visa because the TN visa has no caps. It's renewable indefinitely every 3 years. You know, there's only about 64 professions that qualify for it, but it's perfectly indexed to economic performance. Because when the economy is doing well, the job offers flow, and Canadians and Mexicans get the job offers. They come with a visa. When the economy is not doing well, there are no job offers, so there aren't any requests for additional visas. We ought to really flexibilize our system and think about how we can use the system in our favor instead of taking this restrictionist policy, punitive and aggressive policy that is just going to hurt us.
David, the administration has talked rhetorically about sending American citizens to El Salvador. Is there any precedent for any U.S. administration in, I don't even say modern history, actually being able to effect the deportation out of the United States of American citizens, not revocation of naturalization, but American citizens?
No, I'm not aware of any precedent, and it is truly unthinkable. What is citizenship in the United States? It is the indefinite right to remain in the United States. The Constitution says absolutely nothing about a federal power of deportation, period. Not just including citizens, it says nothing about deportation or removal of non-citizens either. It is a power that has been read in by the courts and then enacted by statute. Many states, including the state of Texas, our Constitution specifically prohibits banishment as a form of punishment. And you could really appreciate why, because in many cases, it is equivalent to or worse than a death sentence.
And a step down from deportation of citizens, the deportation of a legal permanent resident without due process to revoke the status, which happens all the time, usually on the basis of fraud in the application process, premeditated fraud. Is there any precedent for that?
I'm not familiar with any. And one of the challenges here is that the courts have not been friendly to immigrants and non-citizens. And that is to say, we have defined in the United States this plenary power as incumbent and part of sovereignty. And so the vision that the federal government can give and revoke status has been baked into American law for over 150 years, by my count. The challenge here is that Congress has enacted very specific laws, and those laws are what codify the procedures that are due and required. So someone like Mahmoud Khalil, who is a lawful permanent resident, he does indeed have statutory due process rights that have to be honored. The administration may try to circumvent that with laws like the Alien Enemies Act, but and I think the student visa revocations are a really good example of this as well. And so just to put a finer point on that, it's not just that they revoked student visas, which would impact whether students can come and re-enter the country. They altered student statuses. And so what that means is that students who are here, it's April, they're graduating in May, they have internships, they're now out of status, which means they're eligible for deportation. It's got nothing to do with their leaving or coming back. The problem for the administration is that that is illegal, because Congress has codified very specific procedures by which you can revoke or not student statuses. And so that's why the courts are, in many places, stepping up. It just requires a huge effort on the part of civil society to take the administration to court on very short notice while they're flooding the zone. And again, we're seeing systematic attacks, not just on students and immigrants, but on the individuals and organizations that support them and provide legal services.
I think it's a really important point. Right now, I think it's the court that's doing the battle. We saw it with DACA, where the Supreme Court said you cannot revoke a program without going through the Administrative Procedures Act. So the court pushed back at that time. It seems to me that they're beginning to push back. But I'm not kind of concerned about the courts. I think eventually they're kind of playing the role that they're supposed to play in a checks and balance system. I think it's Congress. That's where I'm concerned, because I don't see Congress acting to say, we're going to take back our powers, for example, on tariffs and things like that. I don't see Congress yet taking the role that it's supposed to take and checking the presidency. It may come. It came with Nixon at some point, but we don't know. So far, we haven't seen it.
But what we've been talking about in this session is but one piece of a set of flood the zone challenges. The effective seizure of the U.S. Institute for Peace, which is not a federal government entity, congressionally established, line item funded, not through any other agency, owns its own property through an endowment, and the property is seized and turned over to GSA for ultimate resale. There are a sequence of steps that don't make sense, not even from a retribution or vengeance or ideological standpoint, but to pose a challenge to see whether either the Congress or the courts will say no and make the order stick. And the balance of court decisions so far has been mixed in terms of whether irreparable harm has been done, whether the so-called bull in a china shop argument will obtain, which means you may win your case after litigation, but having won it, there will be nothing for you to win. The entity, whatever it is, will be gone. You can sue for damages, but you no longer will be able to restore what has been lost. This is a complex situation of which immigration, important as it is but one piece.
No, that's absolutely right. And, I think something that is really notable about this court is that we always call it a conservative court. It's 6-3 conservative justices, but I think something that is less obvious is that it's not only conservative in a sort of right-left politics kind of way, it is a court that is extremely favorable to executive power. People like John Roberts and Brett Kavanaugh got their start working at the Office of Legal Counsel, defending executive power. They have very firm visions of what the president should be able to do or not. And so you see the administration launching test cases to challenge, for example, independent heads of agencies, because they see this as a moment and an opportunity to reduce or eliminate congressional control over the exercise of administrative power.
Big issues. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing the United States, Texas, and the world. This episode was produced by Karina Zimmel with support from Maggie Ziganova. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more. Thank you all for listening.